The first warning wasn't loud, but it was final. A restricted zone had just gone live, and every aircraft responded exactly the way they were trained to. Every signal cleared, except one. It didn't turn, didn't slow, didn't even acknowledge the command. At first they thought it was a delay. Then the second warning went out. And that's when the room realized this wasn't a mistake. If you've ever seen something that didn't follow the rules, but wasn't wrong, type "not a mistake" below. The Military Airspace Control Center ran on one principle above everything else: precision. Not just technical precision, the kind measured in altitude and speed and trajectory, but procedural precision, the kind where every action has a defined response, every signal has a defined meaning, and every anomaly has a defined protocol. The entire system had been built, layer by layer, to ensure that nothing in the controlled airspace ever happened without a corresponding action in the room below. Tonight, the room was busy. Radar screens filled with signals, aircraft of various classifications moving through designated corridors, each one behaving exactly as it should, each one a small confirmation that the system was functioning the way it was designed to. The operators work with the focused, practiced efficiency of people who had done this thousands of times. Nothing unusual, nothing out of pattern. Then the restricted zone went live. The command went out immediately, standard protocol, clean execution. Every aircraft in the affected area received the same instruction: exit the zone, confirm compliance, proceed to your designated alternate routing. It was the kind of order the system issued regularly, and the response was always the same. One by one, the signals on the radar adjusted, trajectories shifted, aircraft peeled away from the restricted boundary and rerouted, each one a clean, compliant response to a clear instruction. The operators watched it happen with the quiet satisfaction of a system performing exactly as intended. All of them moved, except one. It sat on the radar display like a fact that refused to change. Same position, same heading, same altitude, no deviation, no adjustment, no indication that the signal had received, or cared about, the command that had just cleared the airspace around it. The first assumption was technical. A system delay, perhaps, a transmission gap, the kind of minor communication lag that occasionally appeared and resolved itself within seconds. The operators gave it a moment. The moment passed. Nothing changed. The second assumption moved toward the pilot. An oversight, maybe, a cockpit distraction, human error, brief but correctable, the kind of thing that resolved itself as soon as attention returned to the instruments. Still nothing changed. She was around 35, in the cockpit, calm. Her instruments showed everything they were supposed to show. Her hands were steady on the controls. Her flight path was clean, not erratic, not aggressive, not the profile of someone who had lost situational awareness or was operating under any kind of distress. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't confused. She hadn't missed the warning. The thing the room hadn't yet considered, the thing that wouldn't fully surface for another several minutes, was the possibility that she had heard the command perfectly, understood it completely, and simply had no reason to respond to it. Not because she was defiant, not because she was reckless, but because the command, as far as she was concerned, wasn't addressed to her. The tension in the room was real, but contained. Everything was still within the boundary of normal procedure. There were more steps in the protocol, more escalation available, more options. Nobody had reached the edge of anything yet, but the signal held its course, steady as ever, and the room began, quietly, to wonder. The second warning went out with more weight behind it. Not louder exactly, the system didn't have a volume dial for urgency, but more direct, more specific. Where the first command had been broadcast to the zone as a whole, this one was targeted, aimed at the single signal that had refused to move. It carried the unmistakable authority of a system that expected compliance and was now formally, officially demanding it. The response was the same as before. Nothing. The control room, which had been operating as a single organism of shared focus, began to fracture slightly. Not dramatically, not into argument or confusion, but into two distinct currents of thought that ran parallel to each other with increasing friction. One current wanted to escalate. The protocol was clear. Non-responsive aircraft in or near a restricted zone triggered a defined sequence of actions, and the sequence existed for good reasons. Every second spent waiting was a second of exposure, a second of uncertainty, a second where something uncontrolled was moving through a space that was supposed to be controlled. Move to the next step. Follow the process. The other current was quieter and harder to name. It wasn't doubt exactly. It was closer to the feeling you get when a pattern you trust completely produces a result that doesn't fit. When the math gives you an answer that's technically correct, but somehow wrong. Something in the data wasn't adding up the way it should, and the people feeling that current weren't yet sure what to do with it. Someone ran a data check. Speed, normal. Altitude, within standard parameters. Flight path, logical, consistent, no erratic behavior. No distress signals. No system flags on the aircraft itself. By every conventional measure, this was a well-operated aircraft following a coherent route. The only anomaly, the single, solitary irregularity in an otherwise clean dataset, was that it hadn't responded to the command. The most dangerous moments aren't when something breaks. They're when everything looks right, except one detail. If you've ever trusted the system too quickly, type "look closer" below. Then someone looked at the metadata, not the surface data, the speed, the altitude, the heading that everyone had already checked. The deeper layer, the classification tags, the identification markers, the background information that the system used to sort and categorize every signal it tracked. The layer that usually resolved quietly in the background, invisible because it almost always worked exactly the way it was supposed to. It wasn't resolving. The signal had data. The data wasn't absent or corrupted, it was present, but it was locked. The system had been trying, automatically and repeatedly, to match the signal against its classification database, to find a category that fit, to generate the standard profile that would tell the operators who they were looking at and what protocols applied. It couldn't find a match. Not because the aircraft was unidentifiable, because the information it would have needed to complete the identification was sitting behind an access level the system wasn't cleared to reach. In the cockpit, she was unchanged. Steady altitude, steady heading, no acceleration, no evasion. She wasn't behaving like someone aware of conflict. She was behaving like someone on a scheduled route, flying through airspace that was, from her perspective, exactly as it should be. Like she had known this conversation was coming. Like she had known, before it started, exactly how it would end. The escalation threshold was approaching. In systems like this one, there's always a point where the automated protocols have exhausted their designed responses, and the situation passes into a different category. One where human judgment has to make a call that the rulebook doesn't fully cover. The room was moving toward that point, not in chaos, not in panic, but in the tightening, deliberate way that happens when trained people realize the ground beneath them is less solid than it appeared. One of the technicians stopped. She had been running through the standard escalation sequence, preparing the next action, moving through the protocol the way she always did, methodically, without hesitation. But something in the data she'd been looking at snagged her attention and pulled her back. She looked at the raw feed again, not the process display, not the clean, interpreted readout that the system generated for the operators to read quickly under pressure. The raw data, the unfiltered stream that came in before the system's classification algorithms touched it, before the interface made it legible, before all the layers of interpretation that turned signal into meaning had been applied. She read through it once, then she read through it again. It wasn't a gap in the data. It wasn't corruption or loss or malfunction. The data was there, complete, intact, transmitting normally. But at a specific point in the identification sequence, there was something she hadn't seen before. A lock. Not an error state, not a flag for incomplete information, a deliberate, structured access restriction, the kind that didn't get applied to civilian aircraft or to standard military operations or to anything that moved through the airspace on a normal day. She submitted an access request. The system paused, genuinely paused, not the brief computational delay of a normal query, but the longer hesitation of a request moving up a chain of authorization that extended somewhere beyond the room's normal reach. The kind of pause that, in a space designed for continuous movement and rapid response, felt unnaturally long. The room had gone quiet. Nobody was speaking. The procedural current that had been pushing toward escalation had stalled, held in place by the collective instinct that something important was about to resolve, or fail to resolve, and that speaking would somehow interrupt it. The screen updated. 2 words. Beyond clearance. The room absorbed them in silence. Not the silence of confusion. Everyone in that room was experienced enough to understand immediately what they were looking at. The silence was something else. The silence of a room full of people who had just discovered, in the most unambiguous terms possible, that the authority they had been exercising over the past several minutes hadn't actually applied. She wasn't an intruder. She wasn't a malfunction. She wasn't a non-compliant aircraft in a restricted zone. She was operating under a classification that sat above the ceiling of what their system was authorized to see, to track, or to direct. The warnings they had issued hadn't been ignored. They had simply been irrelevant to her. Not because she was above the rules, because she was operating under a different set of rules, administered by a different authority that their system didn't have the clearance to access or the standing to invoke. They had not been giving orders. They had been making sounds. The shift in the room was immediate and total. The posture changed. The frame changed. This was no longer an incident requiring intervention. It was an observation, a documentation, something to be noted and stepped away from with the specific, careful neutrality of people who understood they had come right up to the edge of acting outside their authority. A new instruction moved through the room. Not remove the aircraft, not intercept, redirect, escalate, clear surrounding airspace, not to push her out, to move everything else away from her path, to give space to something they now understood they had never been equipped to manage. In the cockpit, she registered none of this. Her altitude held, her heading held, her pace was exactly what it had been at the beginning, unhurried, untroubled, following a route that had apparently never been in question. Because she had never been in the wrong place. She had simply been somewhere their maps didn't fully reach. The signal moved on, not suddenly, not with the abrupt disappearance of something that had been switched off. It moved the way a ship moves past the edge of a harbor, steadily, continuously, until the distance simply became too great for the instruments to maintain contact. It crossed the edge of the radar's effective range and was gone. Not erased, not removed, just beyond. The control room returned to its standard operating rhythm. Screens filled back in with normal traffic. The restricted zone processed its closure sequence. Operators resumed their positions and their routines, moving through the familiar architecture of a shift that, by any official measure, had proceeded without incident. But the atmosphere had changed in a way that procedure couldn't address. One of the senior operators pulled up the log from the past hour. Not because he'd been asked to, not as part of any formal review process, just because he needed to see it again. To look at the sequence of events laid out in the clean, time-stamped language of system records, and confirm to himself that it had happened the way he thought it had. He read through it once. He didn't say anything. He closed the log and went back to his screen. There was no debrief that night, no official discussion, No incident report filed under any of the categories the system provided for anomalies and non-standard events. There was nothing technically to report because nothing technically had gone wrong. That was the part that stayed. Not the signal, not the words on the screen, not the quiet recalibration of the room's understanding in the seconds after those two words appeared. What stayed was the shape of the gap, the space between what they had assumed they could do and what had turned out to be the case. The space between authority and its actual limits. They hadn't been operating at their ceiling tonight, they had simply found it. And the thing about finding a ceiling, really finding it, not theorizing about it, but pressing up against it with the full weight of your certainty and feeling it hold, is that you can't unfind it. It becomes part of how you understand the room you're in, part of how you understand the edges of the space you actually occupy, as opposed to the space you assumed was yours. The radar screen glowed the way it always did. Traffic moved through the corridors the way it always did. But somewhere in the room, the mental map had quietly been redrawn. Not everything that breaks the rules is wrong. Sometimes the rules just weren't built high enough. The real limit isn't what you can control, it's what you were never meant to access. Subscribe to Steelheart Stories Emma if you believe some truths aren't hidden, they're simply beyond reach.